Today on the show, we're joined by Graydon Hazenberg, a Canadian writer, traveler, and international teacher of math and physics. Graydon grew up in Thunder Bay, Ontario, and has spent much of his life exploring the world, visiting over 130 countries and working as a teacher in schools around the globe. He is also known as the author of Pedaling to, I was struggling with this word, Kailash, a vivid travel memoir that follows his 1998 cycling expedition from Pakistan to Tibet, across some of the highest mountain ranges on Earth. Alongside his teaching and writing, Graydon also volunteered in education projects, such as the Olive Tree Learning Center in Zambia. Graydon Hazenberg, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much for having me on your podcast.
And it's an honor. I've heard from people at the school about your stories, so I'm very happy to have you on the podcast.
Well, I hope that we can make an entertaining podcast episode then. The story I wanted to talk about was not the bicycle trip that I wrote about in Pedaling to Kailash, but a different cycling adventure. In 2002, I set off to cycle from China back to Europe along the ancient Silk Road. And it was something I'd been wanting to do for many years, and especially since my Tibet trip in 1998. I really wanted to cycle through all the countries that lay between China and Europe and experience the culture, see the landscapes, and have a bit of adventure along the way. And it turned out I kind of bit off more than I could chew in the first year. So I was supposed to do it all in 1 year. I was going to leave Beijing, or Xi'an, the ancient capital, the place of the terracotta warriors, in May, and by December I was going to be in Turkey. And so I took off, and I cycled for about 6 weeks going west, all the way through the deserts of China. But as I went along, I was feeling less and less well. Yeah. I was really starting to not sleep well, and I felt really emotional. I was losing a bit of weight. I just didn't feel up to my usual self. I had spent the entire year before that cycling as well, so it wasn't like I wasn't used to cycling, but for whatever reason, my body just didn't feel up to it. And I got to this big city in western China called Urumqi, and I had to wait there to get some visas for upcoming countries. And suddenly, I got really, really sick. My ankles swelled up, my elbows swelled up, I couldn't walk, and I ended up stuck in bed for about 3 days in this hotel, just getting worse and worse. There's urine in my blood. There was blood in my urine, which was very, very bad. I mean, something terrible was going on inside. And eventually I had to go to the hospital, and I spent a week in the hospital in China, flew back to Canada, spent another week in the hospital, and then I spent 6 months recovering. And it turned out I had something called rheumatic fever, which you get if you have strep throat and you don't treat it.
Yeah.
Then you can have your own body fighting against the infection, except the infection's not there anymore. It just fights against your own body, so it attacks your joints and stuff. And what's bad about that is it can affect your heart. So I thought there was a reasonable chance I was never going to be able to do that kind of trip again because my heart was going to be damaged. Luckily, after 6 months, I had a bunch of tests, and my heart wasn't damaged, but it took me another year and a half, so a total of 2 years to get back to cycle touring. And so I went back to Urumqi, where I'd been sick before, with my bike, and I just set off west. And so I finished China, and then I went through Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan, through some of the highest mountains in the world, camping every night out in the wilderness, seeing these ancient ruins, very, very cool. And then I went to Uzbekistan. Uzbekistan is famous for all these old cities with these Islamic tiles. They were all built by this guy named Timur, who was a very great builder of cities, but he also was one of the great conquerors of history. So he and his forces killed millions and millions and millions of people all over Asia and Europe. And so he was one of these guys where you see these beautiful buildings, you think, oh, those are fantastic. And then you think about how they got built, you think maybe not so fantastic. And the funny thing was, all the way, every time I would go to a new country, the people in the previous country would say, "You're going to that country? You're going to Kyrgyzstan? You're crazy.
Yeah.
Those people are savages. They're going to kill you." And then the Kyrgyz would say, "Tajikistan, man, there's a civil war. You can't go there." And then they'd say, "You're going to Uzbekistan? Write your will before you go to Afghanistan, to Uzbekistan. It's going to be so dangerous." And each time it was actually totally fine. But everyone agreed that for sure Iran was a terrible place to go.
Yeah.
And people were saying, "There's a war there." And I said, "I'm pretty sure you're thinking about Iraq. Like Iraq, Iran, it's all the same thing." So anyway, I finally bicycled from Uzbekistan to Turkmenistan. It was really, really, really hot across the desert, and then into Iran. And I spent a month cycling through Iran, and it was amazing. The people were so hospitable. If I wanted to, every night I could have slept at somebody's house. People would just randomly walk up to me in the street and say, I see you're traveling. Do you need a place to stay?" And if I felt like it, I'd say, "Sure." And so I'd stay at all these different people's houses, and they would feed me all this good food and sometimes illegal wine. And it was just, they were so kind and so helpful. And I thought, I bet you if some dusty Iranian biker were cycling across Canada, people wouldn't be nearly as welcoming and trusting and hospitable. So I loved that part of it. Wow. But unfortunately, that year I couldn't cycle any further than Iran because I was working starting in August. I was teaching in Egypt. So I had to finish my cycling in Tehran and then fly off to Egypt to work. And it took 5 years to get back to finish the last part of the Silk Road. It wasn't until I finished 2 more teaching contracts in Egypt and then in Myanmar, in Burma. And then I finally had time to finish. And so I flew back to Iran and I bicycled north to south. Before I went east to west, and I went north to south through Iran. And then I went up to Azerbaijan, former Soviet Republic, and then Georgia and Armenia and back to Georgia. And Georgia was amazing. I fell in love with that country. Beautiful mountains, incredibly hospitable people, great food, all this history, these beautiful castles. And people are just really, really nice. And luckily, when I was a kid, when I was in university, I studied Russian. So in all these ex-Soviet countries, I could use Russian, which is great. It meant I could talk to people. When I was in China, I could hardly talk to people. When I was in Iran, I could only talk if people spoke English. But there in those ex-Soviet countries, I could just talk to everybody. And they're really, really, really friendly.
So you can speak Dutch, English,
French, Spanish, some Japanese, a little bit of Italian, I guess.
Wow.
And I can fake lots of languages, okay? I speak a little bit of Chinese, a little bit of Arabic. And a lot of that's from traveling, where you just have to be able to speak enough to survive. So things in China, I could ask, where's the train station? Which way to the museum? Do you have yogurt?
Wow.
Do you sell soft drinks? Things like that I could ask.
That's already somewhat level.
Yeah, but Chinese is actually a simpler language than it looks like. Reading and writing Chinese is terribly difficult, but speaking it is not as hard as you might think. Not that I speak well, but I could speak well enough to ask questions and understand a few answers. And then at the very end of this trip, it was getting cold. It was October, and I went into Turkey, and it was cold. We were way up in the mountains, and it was cold at night, and I thought, oh, man. So I cycled south into the lowlands. I bicycled all the way sort of almost along the Iraqi and Syrian borders. And that was in some ways the coolest part because there were so many historical ruins. The ruins were everywhere, all these old cities and stuff from 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 years ago. And I love history. And so I didn't go in a very straight line. I kept meandering up to go see different ruins. And I really, really enjoyed it. And my hero along this trip was Marco Polo. And so at times I crossed Marco Polo's path in China and then in Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan and in Iran. But in Turkey, I was really following his outward journey, and that was awesome. And I finished up at the place where Marco Polo started his trip.
Wow.
And I rode into town in this little tiny town with an old castle. And there was this apocalyptic rainstorm. It was raining so hard. It was a big thunderstorm. And it was such a great way to finish.
Yeah, I can imagine.
And so when I got there, I thought, man, this thing I've been thinking about for 15 years and doing for 7 years, suddenly it was over. And I thought, now what do I do? And so, in a way, you know, there were sort of a few days of total triumph. Like, oh, that was amazing, that was great. And then I thought, now what do I do? And so I did some more bicycle trips, and I worked in various places, and I've had some amazing adventures, but I don't think that anything will ever completely compare to what a great adventure this was, because it was so far, it took so long, it was physically difficult, and I also just learned so much, like all the cultures that I got to interact with and all the people and the hospitality I got. It was an amazing experience, and it's the sort of adventure that afterwards I don't think you're the same person as beforehand. And that's why I think it's great about any adventure. It changes you. And you hope it changes for the better.
Yeah, I think it's very interesting, especially the comment you said about how if like a Iranian biker would like bike through Canada, how many people would open up their home.
Yeah.
I think that's a very interesting comment, because I never thought about that.
Yeah.
You know, you always point the finger and you say, "Oh, those people wouldn't do it," or "and I'm not the problem."
Yeah.
And then you twist the situation, and it becomes like, "Oh no."
Well, what you realize is that on a bicycle, you're very vulnerable, right? Like, you're not locked in a car or a train. You can hear, smell, see everything going on around you. You have to interact with people all the time, which is, you know, why I learned a bit of Chinese and a bit of Turkish, because I had to be able to go into shops and talk to people. And what you discover is most people around the world are actually pretty nice, pretty hospitable. They're welcoming, they're friendly. And so all these warnings I'd been getting all the way along the way, they were always wrong. I mean, sure, I had a few bad experiences, but overall, just people in general were so nice and so curious. And I had great conversations. In this little place in Kyrgyzstan, we were biking through the mountains, and suddenly this freak snowstorm came down, and we were freezing. We were so cold, my friend and I. I was cycling at this point with this French guy, and we went by a yurt, one of those big felt tents where people spend the summers looking after the goats and the sheep and the cows. And this lady said in Russian, "You're going to freeze to death. Get in here." And so we sat there, and we dried our clothes, and she fed us, and she was just asking us questions, and she was trying to get me to marry a Kyrgyz woman. I said, you know, if you're not married, you must get married, and I'll set it up, or you'll come back to the next summer, we'll have a big wedding ceremony. It was incredibly fun. And you know, if we hadn't been in such a vulnerable position, we wouldn't have ended up in this lady's yurt. And it was amazing. I mean, it was just a really, really interesting, fun conversation. And it's always part of the adventure, is the people you meet.
And then talking about like conversations, and like, I guess not life-changing conversations, but just conversations that change you as a person. Is there like a conversation you've had on the trip that you would say was like a different level, or a very deep conversation that you didn't have much, it was very special?
I thought I had this conversation with this Iranian guy. I was walking through the market in Tehran. It was right at the end of one of the legs of the trip. And he and his friend were playing chess. And I like to play chess. So he said, "Do you want to play?" So I joined him, and we played chess. And we were sitting there talking. And he said, "You know, Iranians," we were speaking English. His English was pretty good. He said, "You know, people think of Iranians as these sort of bearded terrorists who are all shouting, 'Death to America, death to America.'" He said, "You know, there are people like that here, but you know, 80% of us, we're not particularly religious, we're not particularly political. We really just want to live our lives, you know, have our kids, eat some good food, see our kids grow up and go to university and get married and, go out to the countryside on a sunny day and sit under a beautiful tree and have a picnic. That's what we really want. And, it's so ordinary. That never makes the world news. And he said, but that's really what, we are very much like people in other countries. It's just that hardly anybody ever comes to see us. And so you're not aware of it. And so I think that one thing I realized with that conversation, with that trip, is that when you travel somewhere, one of the first things that you notice in a new country is that in some way, or many ways, big or small, what you thought about that country before you went there is wrong. Yeah. It's just not the way it is. And so you get there and you think, wow, this is what things are like. And everyone's experience is different and all that. But I do think that it opens your eyes to how alike we are like this. There's so many human things that everybody has in common. And we often think of, well, there's us and there's everybody else. There's the great other out there. And you travel out into these countries, you think, well, actually, they're the same as us. People, we have different languages and cultures and stuff, but fundamentally, as that guy said, you want to have a nice picnic under a tree, and you want to have a nice family life, and you want to see your kids grow up and that kind of thing. And I think that is so universal. So I think that the more I thought about that conversation, the more I thought, yeah, he's right. He's right that we are all fundamentally so similar, even though you'd never know it to look at the news. I was glad that most of the time my relationships with almost everyone I met were very positive. And people were curious, right? They're just wondering, what is this idiot doing riding his bicycle across Asia? Yeah. What is he doing? And so they would come up to me and talk if we had a language in common. And most of the time they wanted to know, where was I from? What was I doing? How long had I been going? What had I seen? Some people thought, how can he afford to do this? Maybe he's a spy. And so there are all these sort of little conspiracy theories. Yeah. People would come up and ask me, who's really paying for you to do this? And I'd say, actually, I'm paying for it myself. I worked somewhere, I saved some money, and I was curious. And so, in a way, maybe that's an eye-opening thing for some people to think. These really crazy people aren't trying to save money, they're just out to see the world. How weird. Yeah. But maybe it made them also see the world in a different way, I don't know.
And then just things that you saw, was there anything that when you were traveling that you saw something and you're like, I'm never going to be able to unsee that was truly like, it can be a good thing or maybe a bad thing. It could be something that was
I'll tell you, the thing that sticks in my mind the most, I was bicycling across this stretch of the Gobi Desert in China. It was really dry and really hot. I was running low on water. And it was, there was some element of concern that I was going to run out of water before I got to a water source. And I was biking along, and I was looking down, and I could see stuff, garbage on the side of the road. Suddenly I thought, that looks weird. So I stopped and came back to look at it. I realized it was a dead body. It was a dead human.
What?
And I looked at him, and I was thinking, how did he end up here? And I had seen mentally ill people wandering the roads. Anywhere in the world, there are mentally ill people. Sure. And so you get these people, these tramps who are just sort of traveling along the road. And I think it was one of these guys, his clothes were pretty ragged, what I could see. And I think he might have been hit by a truck.
Wow.
And either that or he just ran out of water and fell down. But his head, it looked as though he'd had a head injury. So I wondered whether a truck had been driving by and had hit him with the mirror. And they hadn't even noticed. And he just laid down and died right there. And I thought, oh, this is really sad. And I thought I should tell somebody about this. And so for the next 200 or 300 kilometers, I had looked up in my dictionary how to say in Chinese, I found a dead body beside the road. But I never found, I was in the middle of nowhere. There was no one to tell.
Of course.
And so for all I know, that guy is still lying out there, just dead beside the road in the middle of nowhere. And But I was thinking the whole time, you know, if I don't find water soon, I could end up like this guy. So I'd better find some water.
Yeah.
And I did, luckily. But it was very, very hot and dry. But I mean, that definitely was what stuck with me the most, was that encounter.
For the last thing I want to ask you
Yeah.
is, if you had to summarize in, I would say maybe in a few sentences, how did this experience or like adventure shape you as a person that would change you for the rest of your life?
Well, I think I probably believed this beforehand, but definitely afterwards, much more strongly. I realized that something that someone said to me once when I was much younger is very true. And he said, you can always make more money. You can never make more time. So it's important to make the most of the time that you have. And you realize that it's true. You know, you can do the same thing in life over and over again, go to the same job day in, day out, year in, year out. And if it's not something that's exciting you, this is time that you're never going to get back. So maybe you should make better use of it. And so I really feel now, especially now that I'm a bit older, that you have to make the most of the time that you've got. And, you know, not everyone wants to ride a bicycle across Asia, but everyone has something that they really want to do. And many people never get round to doing it because they're busy with other things, or they're scared to try it or whatever. And I think whatever it is you have in life that you really want to do, passionately want to do, you should do it, because you only live once. You might as well make an effort to make that dream come true. So you can never make more time. So I think it's really important.
Yeah, I agree.
And this trip brought it home to me.
Really?
Yeah.
Nothing, just driving into that small town in Turkey, right?
Yeah.
Was there, like, you're driving in, and then when did you just press on those brakes and say, this is where I think I finished? Like, was there?
Well, I knew that this is the place I was going to stop, because I knew this is where Marco Polo had started.
Yeah.
And I came in this crazy apocalyptic rainstorm. The pictures are just crazy. It's dark and hail is coming down. So it was a very dramatic entry. But once I had finished, I thought, okay, and now I don't want to ride my bicycle tomorrow. I've done what I've set out to do. And it was a real feeling of accomplishment. I loved it. And so for about 4 days, all I did was get out of bed, eat, and go back to bed. I was so tired. Because I've been going so hard for so long, and then to finally think that I'm finished was such a relief.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Well, thank you very much for interviewing me, and I hope that some of you listening out there get inspired to have adventures of your own. It might just change your life as well.